All right, Adidia, take it away.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Virtual Shadowing Session 96. Tonight, we will have a session on radiation safety with Mr. John White. As usual, this is our working group composed of Taylor, Rohit, Kiana, Elena, Shayan, Ali, myself, Christina, and Ashita, as well as our faculty directors, Dr. Fowler, Dr. Salazar, Dr. Lin, and Dr. Reno. For our upcoming sessions, next week we'll have a session on patients dealing with chronic pain. Following that, we'll have another PA spotlight on plastic surgery. I know many of you students are pre-PA and are really looking forward to these PA sessions. After that, on May 10th, we will have a specialty spotlight in dermatology. Followed by session 100, we will be having a wilderness and environmental medicine expert as he shares his journeys traveling through Antarctica and practicing medicine. As usual, we'll have a quiz following each session. We will share the link to this 10-question multiple choice quiz in the chat, as well as via QR code at the very end of the session. When you pass with a 70% or higher, you'll be prompted to download a certificate that verifies your attendance and participation in our session. You will have 1 week to complete this quiz. Additionally, for those of you that stick around till the very end, we will be reopening session 20, just as extra incentive for everyone to stick around till the very end and allow you to earn a few extra hours for virtual shadowing. We will have 2 Q&A sessions, one in the middle and one at the very end. Please feel free to put your questions in the main chat. Try not to direct message us because they may be overlooked. Dr. Fowler, would you like to say a few words?
Yes, thank you, Adidia, and welcome to our guest tonight. And welcome to all of you to Virtual Shadowing. It's so good to have you here. We're nearing 2 years on this interesting adventure that we've all had together. And so many of you have been with us through all of these many months, even years, of this exciting program. I've mentioned before, but just to say that on the admissions committee at the medical school, at our school here at UT Southwestern, we very much gave credit to virtual online hours for clinical shadowing. And so we hope that this program will help you in your applications for healthcare, whatever your track may be. And so welcome. We do ask that when you take the exam, you'll see a note about a GoFundMe possibility. And if the program is free to you, and it will continue to be free, but if you can afford $1 or more, please contribute. This program actually costs nearly $10,000 a year to put together. We have external funding. We're doing fine, but it would be great to have some funding from those that we're supporting in their applications for healthcare. So thank you for your consideration on that. And with that, Adidia, we have a very exciting guest this evening. Would you introduce him?
Yes, sir. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Mr. John White as he walks us through his journey in his career and teaches us about radiation safety. Mr. White, please take it away. Feel free to share your screen.
Okay. Oh, we have to have technical issues.
Yep.
Okay.
Perfect.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is John White. I am currently the radiation safety officer for the VA hospital in North Texas, which is clearly the most complex and arguably the largest in the United States. I am not representing the Department of Veterans Affairs in this presentation. This is entirely on my own. All the images that you see in here are fair use and may not be reproduced without permission of the originator. Let me tell you a little bit about myself before we get going. I grew up in Fort Worth, Texas, about 1.5 miles from Panther Hall, don't you know, and I can talk like a Texan when I need to. I graduated from high school, went to the University of Texas at Austin and the University of Texas at Arlington, graduated with a degree in pre-medicine. There was just a whole host of reasons why I did not go to medical school. But what I did after I graduated was I went to Parkland Hospital and I worked for free in the nuclear medicine department. My degree from college was in pre-medicine and biology with physics. And I decided I'd learn about medicine from the radiation point of view. So I worked in nuclear medicine for free. And I got a job at John Peter Smith Hospital in Fort Worth, where I became chief technologist in nuclear medicine. Well, they weren't paying me diddly as a nuclear med tech. So my dad was a ham radio operator, and I answered the ad from a defense industry corporation for somebody that knew about electrons and physics. So I went to work for a company called Vero that made pocket dosimeters. And I actually created the kind of little tube-like pocket dosimeters that you carry in your pocket. And after a while there, I got a job offer from another defense contractor. I am the senior systems engineer. I designed, built, installed, and tested the communication control systems on Air Force One, E-4B, and EC-135, and a number of systems. And you know what happened? The Soviet Union collapsed. I got a check. They said, here's the door. Thank you. Bye. So I went to work at the University of Texas at Austin at the nuclear reactor there, the Trigger reactor, a small reactor, research reactor, only 1 megawatt. And I worked there for 10 years. And then I had a chance to transfer back up to the Dallas-Fort Worth area where I'm from. So I transferred to the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center at Dallas, where I became radiation safety officer for both the radiation producing machines program and the radioactive materials program. Worked there for 10 years. And I got a call from the VA here in Dallas one day, and they said, our radiation safety officer doesn't like it here. His wife wants to go back to South Carolina. Can you help us? And I said, oh, sure, I can do that. So I said, I could retire. I've been 20 years with the University of Texas system. And they said, okay, please. So now I have my state retirement and my federal paycheck. I'm doing okay. So during that time, I met the estimable Dr. Fowler and have worked with him for a number of years. I've been delighted to be a trainer in the National Disaster Life Support Foundation. And I am a radiological operations support specialist, or ROS, for the Department of Homeland Security. And I'm a member of the VA's MERT, the Medical Emergency Radiological Response Team for the United States. So I'm heavily involved in radiation response. Now, what I'm going to talk to you about today, I'm going to give you a basic radiation primer that you've had the information, but it's a refresher. So I'll blast through it pretty fast. And then I'm going to move on to something that is now rearing its ugly head again, and that is nuclear weapons. They're very bad. Yes, we've all heard of it. Hey, I'm a leading edge boomer. I was one of the kids that crawled under the desk and stuck my head between my legs, and kissed it goodbye. But many of you don't understand what nuclear weapons really do. And since the specter has arisen again, I'm going to go over this a little bit, and you're going to see a video that is dramatic. Well, here we are. This is the North Texas area. That is the state of Connecticut to scale. The DFW area has roughly twice the population, pushing $1 trillion now. They're over 14,000 square miles. There's some cooperation amongst 143 cities and 25 counties, but we're very large. We are the 4th largest metropolitan area in the country. Next slide. This is the electromagnetic spectrum. You carry a radio in your pocket or your purse. Now, the Swedes think if we strap this to your head and talk on it for 24 hours a day for 30 days, your brain will get an exposure from the radio waves. Yeah, but you will be insane from the lack of sleep, but that's okay. When you put something in the microwave and nuke it in the nuker, when it comes out of the microwave oven, it's not emitting microwaves. It's the two hydrogens attached to the oxygen in water have increased their vibration rates, called heat. You currently have 2 radiation detectors on your body. 3, really. Number 1, you can directly perceive heat. Number 2, you are looking at this with your eyes. They are detecting radiation. You can go out in the sun and get a sunburn from the ultraviolet, but you can't perceive the ultraviolet directly. We use X-ray machines to look inside people without cutting them open because surgery is hard on a body. We have therapy units that deliver tightly collimated beams that kill the tumor without killing the patient. And right now, wherever you are sitting in a sleet of cosmic rays, primarily iron nuclei traveling at about 80% of the speed of light, and they go right through your body and do DNA damage on the way through. So radiation is all around us. My goal with telling you about this is to try to desensitize you from what Hollywood and the entertainment industry have done. They've made you very afraid of radiation. After all, you know that if you are bitten by a radioactive spider, you're going to develop spidey strength and climb walls and have all sorts of gifts. And if you are hit by cobalt-60 gamma rays, you're going to turn big and green and stupid and angry. Hulk angry. Well, that's what the entertainment system has done to people. And yes, they believe it. Next slide, please. So what are the types of radiation? Well, non-ionizing radiation is long wavelength, low frequency. They don't knock electrons loose. They just excite things a little bit. Ultraviolet and infrared energy, they're low energy, long wavelength radiation. Next slide. Ionizing radiation is different. You've heard these terms: alpha, beta, neutron, gamma ray. Well, gammas come from the nucleus only. It's this high frequency, small wavelength, very energetic. When they hit your body, they create free radicals, which are very biologically active, and they break DNA strands. You already receive 10 to the 12th DNA strand breaks per year in your body just from radiation. 10 to the 12th. Your body has good repair mechanisms. Next slide, please. What we do with radiation specialists is we give them a little quiz. You are given a source. You're given one of each of these sources: alpha, beta, gamma, neutron. You get to hold one in your hand. You get to put one in your pocket. You must swallow one, and you get to throw one as far as you can. What do you do with what? Well, with alphas, they're not going to penetrate your skin. You hold it in your hand. Your betas, your clothes will stop them, so you put it in your pocket. Gammas, they're going to go through you anyway, so you swallow that thing. You throw the neutron as far as you can, because neutrons make things radioactive. They're sticky. Next slide, please. So we have measurements of radiation exposure. The Röntgen equivalent man, named after Conrad Röntgen. The rim is a fairly large thing. Think of a number 10 can, which in this country is, I believe, about 8 to 9 inches in diameter and around 10 inches tall. If it's full of dimes, that's almost exactly 1,000 dimes. That's a rim. We use large quantities of rim in therapy, and we are aware of high exposures with rim. A millirem is 1,000th. Think of 1 dime. We use tens of millirems for diagnosis and therapy in nuclear medicine. A microrem is 1/1,000,000th of a rem. We use that on laboratory benchtops and in research. Next slide. So how are you exposed? If you fly in a jet plane, you're up out of the atmosphere, much higher. So you're exposed to less shielding from the atmosphere, from the giant unshielded thermonuclear furnace called the sun, and it is a bad boy. If you have a radium wristwatch, you get some exposure from that. Concrete is radioactive. Some heavy dental prostheses may be radioactive. Food and water have radiation in them. There's radon in the air coming out of the ground. All those food items that you see there are radioactive because 0.03% of the potassium in the world is radioactive potassium-40. Was formed in the Big Bang and out in supernovae, has a half-life of 10 to the 9th years, puts off a significant gamma. People who are on sodium-restricted diets that eat potassium, use potassium chloride, more no salt on foods, those people get a little more. As a matter of fact, if you don't have a major medical procedure in your life from fluoro or some other diagnostic or therapeutic procedure, the most radiation you will get in your life will come from the person you marry and sleep next to 8 hours a night, because everyone is radioactive, because our food is radioactive. Next slide, please. Beer is radioactive. Sorry, guys. Yeah, it is. It's got potassium in it, and you need potassium. Bananas are radioactive. They have a lot of potassium. Cigarettes are remarkable. If you've ever seen a tobacco plant, they're only about 4 or 5 feet tall. They don't have many leaves. The leaves are, 12 or 13 inches, more than 20 centimeters wide. And gosh, they're almost a meter long, terribly long. They have tiny little Christmas tree structures all over the top of them. They feel like velvet. So that's a large surface area. So the polonium-210 from atmospheric nuclear testing way back more than 50 years ago lands on the leaf and stays there. So when you smoke cigarettes, you suck burning vegetable matter into your lungs and they damage your alveolar fields. Number 2, the tars and nicotines leach into the tissues. They're poison. We spray nicotine on fruit trees to kill insects. It works real well. Number 3, the polonium-210 decays and zaps the tissue with an alpha particle, a bowling ball. So a pack of cigarettes is equivalent to a chest x-ray of radiation delivered directly to the tissue of your lungs. If you live in Denver instead of Dallas, you get twice as much radiation. If you live in Denver, you're further out of the atmosphere. It's a mile high. And they're living on top of granite. You know what's in granite that's radioactive? Uranium. It's just how it is. The world around us is radioactive. Next slide, please.
Hey, John.
Yo.
I heard that 2 CAT scans of your abdomen give you as much radiation to your body as if you had stood 1 mile from ground zero at Hiroshima.
Oh, I wouldn't doubt that at all. Yes, that is true. The CAT scans do deliver a lot of radiation. Actually, it's fairly soft radiation. It passes through you. And yes, you do get some exposure. But I'm going to talk about exposures and tolerances here in a moment. So I'll see if I can put that in perspective for you. Yes, a CAT scan is about 2,500 millirem, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So on this chart here, this is the bottom line. If you are single and you smoke and you are fat, and you drank beer, and you drive a truck, you're in deep doo-doo. This is time taken off of your life from your behaviors. I'd like to compare and contrast that with people who work with radiation for a living. You see this? So you can control how long you live and how well you live. But working with radiation is a manageable risk. You can manage the risk from radiation exposure. Next slide, please. Here we are. The dose limit that we allow to radiation workers is 5,000 millirem a year. So 2,500 millirem from a CT doesn't really do much. If we have a major problem, then you're allowed double that without much detriment. Up to 25,000 millirem, 25 rem, that's life-saving. Now we're talking about some serious exposure. We allow people to receive over 25 rem to work a major incident with signing a piece of paper. Okay, next slide, please. And here we are, Dr. Fowler, directly addressing your question. Up to 25,000 millirem, we can see no detectable effect whatsoever. It's possible there could be some statistical or probabilistic effect further out in your life after about 20 years. When they had the big Fukushima problem that the reactors went down, they recalled people that had retired, the old people, because they could get an exposure and not show any radiation effects unless they were very major. Now, over 25,000 millirem, we can see some DNA breaks before your body repairs them, but your body will repair most of them. 25 to 100,000 millirem, yeah, that's a bad airplane flight. You know, we see some blood changes, the hematopoietic syndrome. I've actually rushed back to Parkland emergency room when I was at UT Southwestern because an individual out in the oil fields in East Texas thought he was exposed to a great amount of radiation. And we ran the Andrews lymphocyte nomogram because it was about 30 days after exposure, and he had not received that. So we know how to test this. Over 100,000 to 200,000 millirem, that's a bad airplane flight. You know, you got some problems. You're not going to be feeling good, but we can keep you alive, okay? A lot of reverse isolation, cytokine use, some other things, okay? Next slide, please. Over 450,000 millirem. That's the lethal death, the LD, 50% of the population in 60 days without medical care. These people are heavily injured, but we can keep them alive up to about 1,000 millirem, a million millirem, 1,000 rem. These people are really sick. We have kept people alive that have received this much radiation, but it's been touch and go. It's very serious, major interventional situation. Over 5,000, over 1,000, you're toasted. You know, you're going to die. The Russian spy, Alexander Liveninko, who drank polonium-laced tea in a cafe in London, essentially digested himself from the inside out. It took him 2 weeks to die. It was very ugly. And pictures of him are quite dramatic. The funny thing is, we expected a whole lot of genetic effects after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japanese studies. We did not see them. It turns out that Homo sapiens is actually fairly radio resilient, that we can repair a lot of DNA damage from radiation exposure. Next slide, please. So, how dangerous is radiation? Well, let's put it to 25,000 people in a survey. The general public, how dangerous is it? Okay, hit the next button. There we go. The League of Women Voters, 25,000 people. Nuclear power is extremely dangerous. Let's talk to the people that really know what the risks are, that understand the risk of being around radiation. You see how the public views a radiological hazard? But I'm telling you, incipient physicians, hopefully, that radiation is a manageable risk. Let me tell you a story here. 7 years ago, the house next to my home caught fire and burned. 2:30 in the morning, I heard a thump, and I opened an eye, and here's a glow on the ceiling of my bedroom. And I'm hearing at the same time somebody banging on my front door. The guy says, the house next to you is on fire, get out. So I and my family were out on the sidewalk on our back in our bathrobes, and here's firemen in all their bunker gear. They're foaming my house to keep it from catching fire. What had happened is that they had turned off the water to the property, but they hadn't turned off the gas. They had a gas water heater, and there was a leak in the water line, so it went down, and the water heater caught fire. So I'm hearing this fireman in bunker gear with all these noises around him. Zzz, zzz, beep, 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 whittle, whittle, whittle. I said, what is all that gear? Once this was over, I talked to him. I said, what's all that sounds? He said, they're testing equipment to let us know the risk so we can manage the risk. You in medicine will be working around dangerous things, diseases, sharp, sticky things, methyl death, radioactive materials, x-rays. You manage your risk by knowing what you're doing. Next slide, please. So here are some of the radioactive materials we use in medicine and other places in industry. This chart goes way down below the bottom of the screen. Many, many isotopes, and they run around town in trucks every day, every city in the world. That's how medicine is. We use radiation as a tool, and it is a very useful tool. It lets us look inside someone and not only see structures, but also see function. Nuclear medicine is about function. We inject a radiopharmaceutical into a patient, and then we put them under a $2 million camera, and we watch and see how they look and how that organ is functioning. Next slide, please. These are the types of exposure. Irradiation is radiation coming from outside your body. External contamination is radioactive material in someplace you don't want. Internal contamination is when you get it inside you. And that's what happened to Alexander Liveninko. It destroyed his gastrointestinal system as a heavy metal that emitted alpha particles, very powerful isotope. Next slide, please. If you get contaminated, the best thing to do is take off your clothes because most of the contamination goes with your clothes. Look at this slide. That's a man on the left, a woman on the right. They were on an island when a nuclear test occurred in the South Pacific. Now, who in the world wears long sleeve shirts and long pants in the South Pacific? The answer is the military. So these are actual measurements of where the materials were. Next slide, please. You have to have a detector to know where radiation is. You have to. We have detectors that you wear, we have detectors you hold, and special detectors. Next slide, please. It's an interaction of radiation with matter. The human being cannot sense the ionizing radiation. You cannot see the blue glow off of regular materials. That comes from when starting a nuclear reactor and it glows because of Cherenkov radiation. Speaking of Cherenkov radiation, a paper came out yesterday discussing how the Cherenkov radiation from certain positron-emitting isotopes used in nuclear medicine, the Cherenkov radiation can help determine the extent and location of cancers. Brand new, just yesterday, we're going to see a lot of research. The field of nuclear medicine is burgeoning. We now have an area called theranostics, where we use a particular compound to locate prostate cancer. And we use a small amount of radioactive material attached to it, and we diagnose it. We use a large amount to do therapy. A human cannot sense ionizing radiation, but the equipment can. And we have ways to read this. We give readings. The key is, how do you interpret it? Do you know how to read a meter? Do you know how to read an X-ray? Do you know how to read a nuclear medicine study, which is dramatically different than an X-ray? You must understand the detector and how sensitive it is. Next slide, please. These are detectors that you can buy and hold in your hand. We use these at my hospital. Most hospitals have a variation of one of these. On the upper left corner is something you can buy on eBay. They were built in the 1950s and 60s. You can buy one on eBay for, $50. You can buy one on eBay guaranteed to work for $75, and you can buy one on eBay guaranteed to work and calibrated for about $100. Spend the $100 if you want one of these. They're mostly high range, so they're used only in dramatic situations. But if you need a radiation meter, you can get one for fairly cheap. The rest of them cost several hundred to several $1,000s, depending on what you want it to do. The next one, please. Next slide. These are RIDs, radioisotope identification device. They are a computer. You can buy them small enough to hold in your hand for about $3,000. You can buy others for up to $10,000, up to $35,000 for one you can drop and kick across the floor. Is militarized. But these will actually take a spectroscopic reading and see exactly what the isotope is you're dealing with. Most emergency response agencies in most cities in the world have RID. They have a RID that will determine what the isotope is. Next slide, please. There are portal monitors that are very sensitive that we can walk through or drive vehicles through that will detect the radiation, and it detects very small amounts. They go off very fast, but we can screen people to see, or vehicles to see if they have radiation or contamination. The detectors on these things are fairly large and they're very sensitive. Next, please. There's even some that people carry on their backs and can detect radiation. They are a large detector. They interface with a little app, as you can see on the lower right-hand corner of the slide. At major sporting events in our country and other countries, there are people with backpacks out there looking for radiation. Yes, it does screen out for medical isotopes, so they don't get alarmed on medical isotopes, but other isotopes, absolutely, they will alarm. So there's a lot of equipment out there that we use to detect radiation, not just in nuclear medicine. Next slide, please. You have little personal dosimeters that you wear. I wear one like the one directly in the center. I have electronic meters that give immediate reading. There are some you have to mail off and get developed so you can find out what your exposure was. If it's an urgent situation or a dangerous situation, we will issue an electronic personal dosimeter. There's a tremendous amount of equipment around there that allows us and enables us to detect the exact isotope, the quantity, intensity of radiation, and the danger and risk of being around it so you can manage your risk. Next slide, please. How do you protect yourself? Okay, here's where the rubber meets the road. The longer you're around the radiation source, the more radiation exposure you get. When you're near a campfire and you get hot and you turn around and your back end gets hot, the longer you're there, the hotter you are. It's linearly cumulative, okay? Next slide. The closer you are, the dramatically more radiation you get. If you've ever changed a light bulb right after it burned out, it's hot. It's really hot up close, but move a little way away from it, you can't feel anything. Same exact principle of physics. Let me tell you how this works. If you double the distance, the intensity is lowered by a fourth. Let me tell you how this works in a hospital. There are people that develop thyroid cancer. You know, your thyroid gland is in your throat, absorbs 99.9999% of all the radiation your body ever, all the radioactive materials, radioiodine to be specific, your body ever sees. All the iodine goes to your thyroid gland. And thyroid cancer is a fairly common cancer. You know what cancer is. Out of control growth, breaks off to go to the other parts of the body, metastasis. What we do with thyroid patients is we will give them a dose of radioactive iodine, and we will put them, if they don't have a good home living situation, we will put them in a lead-lined room in the hospital, and you've got to go see them. How do you manage your risk? It's pretty simple. You go to the nursing station, you see they've had a thyroid treatment with radioiodine, you get your ducts lined up, you go in and you knock on the door and you see the signs on the wall, signs on the door to the patient's room that warn about radiation and tell you how long you can stay in the room, and you go talk to that patient. Now, is that person having a good day? No. So you're kind to them and understanding. They're probably afraid of radiation. They can't have any visitors. They can't leave the room. Everything around them is wrapped in plastic, and the floor has diaper paper on it. And it's a real strange thing. All their food's delivered on disposables, so they're very careful. Well, you got to go see them. And what do? Number one, you control how much time that you're around this patient. You go in and talk to them, and you don't hang. Once you're done, you leave. You control the distance to the patient. If you take one step back, that doubles the distance, and your exposure goes down by 4. 2 steps back, you've tripled the distance. Your exposure goes down by 9. 3 steps back, you quadrupled it, goes down by 16. You get the picture? Let's see the next slide here. Here's an example of that. We have a really hot source there on the left. 1,000 MR per hour. That's an R per hour on contact. That's hot. Back off 5 feet down to 40 MR per hour. 10 feet down to 10. 20 feet down to 2.5. 30 feet, that's a good distance, down to 1.1. Much more than that, you're down to background. You manage your risk by controlling your risk factors. Next slide, please. Shielding, maybe, maybe not. You know, the fireman's SCBA, that self-contained breathing apparatus, and all the bunker gear they wear protects, the SCBA protects against internal, and their heavy duty gear protects against external, but only alphas. Betas will sort of be stopped by their bunker gear. No protection against gamma radiation. You don't want the radioactive material inside you. You wear masks and gloves. Universal precautions. Next. You don't necessarily need your level C or B or A protection. I notice the guy in the background has nothing. Well, can you find a vein on this person with that kind of PPE on, personal protective equipment? No, you don't need that. Next slide. Yeah, go ahead. This is a Toronto paramedic, you know, during SARS, the first SARS epidemic. Well, what I see is her hair. You know, she's going to have to cut her hair or it's going to get real seriously washed. That's what you need in order to protect yourself from radioactive absorption contamination. Oh, and you know, I am confident some of you saying, well, I really need a protection from gamma rays. Well, I got something. Go ahead. Next slide. Yep, there you are. Shielding suit for gamma radiation. Weighs 3,000 pounds. You won't be able to do anything, but you won't get those nasty gamma rays in you. You learn how to manage your risk. Next slide. No, that's from Lost in Space. That's Robbie the Robot. Okay, so lead aprons. Well, give me a lead apron. Well, of course, and lead glasses and a thyroid shield, right? That's what I need, right? Not really. Lead aprons are extremely effective at shielding you from X-rays. The leaded glasses protect the lens of your eye. Physicians that do a lot of radiology will develop cataracts, radiation cataracts. The thyroid shield covers the thyroid in your throat. But if you wear that kind of gear around a nuclear medicine patient who has received a radioisotope, regardless of whether or not it's diagnostic or therapeutic, then the lead aprons will actually soften the radiation to where your body absorbs it better. We use the lead aprons in fluoro suites and CT, although for most of the time, CT is done while the operator is outside the room in a control room. Sometimes a parent will get to hold a child who's having a CT. And do you want to hold that child as a tech? No. How many children are you going to have to hold every day? So you get the parent to do it who's only exposed to what the child is exposed to. And we badge them, we put a dosimeter on them to see what they're exposed to. Next slide, please. So there are 2 fundamental types of radiation use in medicine. Machine-produced radiation, which is X-rays, or accelerated particles, protons or electrons. We have several things I'll talk about here in a little bit, but it's machine-produced radiation, X-rays, or therapeutic radiation, or radioactive materials, radioisotopes, radiopharmaceuticals, and other tracers. Those are the 2 fundamental types of radiation used in medicine. Next slide, please. Here are general radiation use areas in medicine, okay? Radiology, X-rays, CT, fluoro, machine-produced radiation. Nuclear medicine, use of radioisotope radiopharmaceuticals, pharmaceuticals that are tagged with a radioactive material. Laboratory diagnosis and measurement is done on a benchtop with isotopes to blood. They are used, radiation is used in oncology. That's where we have the accelerators that will generate particles that are very focused onto a tumor. Brachytherapy, brachy means close therapy, which is where we can use a wire line to treat a scalp cancer by putting a line, a wire on the scalp. See, I know you can see that, of the patient, and you run a radioisotope source and do radiotherapy on that spot. That's near therapy. Teletherapy is that external beam therapy. There's not a lot of teletherapy units around lately except for accelerators. We do have products. We have one at our hospital called a CyberKnife. It is a robotic arm, just like the kind you see making cars, only it has a tightly collimated beam of x-rays that come out and irradiate the tumor. So we can put a lot of radiation into the tumor without harming the patient. There's also something called a gamma knife, which is several hundred sources, usually cobalt-60, that the head goes into a very large thing that they open various ports to be able to focus radiation and kill a tumor in the brain. Gastroenterology and urology use fluoroscopy quite a bit. Audiology does. Yes, they look and see how people talk from the side with fluoroscopy to see how to correct speech. Several types of surgery use fluoro and other items, other X-ray producing machines. Interventional radiology is a specialty field in radiology where they use fluoroscopy to do all sorts of surgical type procedures. As a matter of fact, one of the therapies that we're doing right now, fairly new, is called yttrium-90 TheraSpheres or microspheres. We use both TheraSpheres and SurSpheres from two different companies. One is resin, one is glass. And what we do with that is we go into interventional radiology, and the surgeon in IR puts a catheter directly into the artery that goes to the liver. Nuclear medicine brings in vials of microspheres. They're 0.01 millimeters in diameter, and they're tagged with yttrium-90, which is a powerful isotope. And they inject that material directly into the catheter, directly into the liver. And that's a very interesting thing. You really don't want to spill that stuff because those tiny little beads bounce and roll in the very dry air in the surgical suite. I have been part of a spill of that stuff, and you close down the suite. Nobody gets out. You get on your hands and knees and Swiffers and inverted duct tape and pick up all the tiny little balls. We use 7 million or so of them. Cardiology uses radiation quite a bit. You bet. Blood treatment. Yes, we have to damage blood when we take blood from one person and give it to another to prevent reactions to blood infusions. And we use it, of course, in research. We use it on benchtop in vitro, and we use it in vivo. We use radioactive materials and X-rays in research. Next slide, please.
Yes, sir. One moment. Let me just switch over to the next slide set.
Okay, thank you. That was the longest of the three. No, living next to a linear accelerator the size of the one at Stanford will not get to you. The distance thing is important. That's all right.
So, John, do you think that with the passing of time, given the radiation risks that we use in medicine, for example, I use CAT scans. We do CAT scans like water in the emergency department. Do you think that we may see limits over time of the use of these devices, of CAT scans?
Absolutely. You certainly will. As a matter of fact, right now there is a major program. It actually started about 15 years ago with children. The program is called Image Gently because at that time, I want to say it's more like 17 years ago, routine adult-sized techniques were used with X-ray machines to do radiographs on children. And that's too much exposure. So a program started, and government sponsored it too, called Image Gently. And that spread to adults. It's called Image Wisely. Do you really need a fresh chest? Unless the patient is dynamic. Think about it. Do you need another CT? They just had one last week. What has changed that would justify giving them that amount of radiation? As a matter of fact, it's being formalized now by the Joint Commission in the United States that requires hospitals to monitor the amount of radiation given to a patient and control that. Doctors, particularly radiologists, are counseled, and surgeons or emergency room docs are asked, do you really need another CT? It's only been 12 hours or 24 hours, simply to control the radiation exposure. Probably in the future, you and I and everybody else will probably have a USB drive that has our radiation history on it when we go to a medical institution. As an example, a concrete example, we have issues when veterans are in an accident and come to Parkland and they get radiological procedures for whatever, and then they come over to the VA for more care. or to extend or complete their care. And we need to know what those patients are exposed to. Sometimes we find out, sometimes we don't. But this is a major effort nationwide in the United States. And I know also in Australia, South America, and most of Europe, that is being worked right now to try to control the radiation exposure and not give more radiation than necessary. This is actually a species project to keep the radiation exposure to the human race under control so we don't use too much medical radiation.
So, John, let's say we have a trauma and the X-ray tech comes in with a portable X-ray machine. How do we limit or control or monitor the X-ray exposure by the X-ray tech?
Well, the tech will do the procedure that he's supposed to do. And what happens then is that information, because that's an emergent situation where you must know what is going on. You have no information. You need to look inside the patient without cutting them open. What happens then is that information that the portable or whatever machine is used gives the patient is put into a data system where the patient's PACS or whatever it's called, the data system in the hospital has a record of the radiation exposure to that patient. It's fairly mathematically, it's mathematical gymnastics is what it is to get the amount of radiation that the machine is delivered and estimate the dose to the patient. It's a close estimation, but that is a database that is established for that patient in your care. So that has improved tremendously over the last 10 years. And now we have a fairly decent system, but sometimes we don't know if that patient has already been to another hospital. We just don't know.
All right, take it away.
Okay. We know what you're exposed to. The critical item about radiation risk management is that we know what radiation does. We know what radiation does not do. It does not make you spontaneously mutate. Okay. That's fiction. That just doesn't work like that. I've been working with radiation for this is my 50th year that I've been around radiation as a professional. I don't have a third arm, sorry. My daughter's hair is blue, but she's an artiste, so okay, whatever. So in any case, we know what the radiation does, okay? We establish a limit for radiation worker. This comes from the International Council on Radiation Protection and the United States National Council on Radiation Protection, 5,000 millirem per year. And emergency response workers can be allowed more. Life-saving efforts, yeah, we extend it then, but they have to sign a paper if they're going to be exposed to more than that. And that is possible. So we have protection levels that we follow. Firemen have a nominal turnaround level of 2 to 5 millirem an hour. If their detectors show up at that level, then they must turn around and get professional radiation consultation in order to be able to work the scene. We do allow them to do what's called snatch and grab. Well, they will run into a hot radiation zone and grab the patient and pull them out to get them out of there. And that's one of the ways we limit is shorten the time and the distance there around the radiation source. Next slide, please. Okay, you've just had an in-depth sort of radiation primer, the basics of radiation understanding. Now I'm going to talk to you about the evil thing that has reared its head again, and that is radiation accidents. The reason it's important for you to know about this is not just, go ahead, not just, that's good, not just the general factor of you working in medicine, because you may have to deal with one of these incidents, but we are at risk more now from dirty bombs or nuclear detonations than we have been in, 40 years, 30 years, pick a number. Number one is a nuclear power plant incident. Yes, we could have, it could be an early warning. Yes, we could know about it really early. You bet. Evacuations is all set up. In every nuclear power plant in the world, there are evacuation zones where people that live inside that zone know what they're supposed to do. Every power plant in the world. A lot of them are in France, a number in Japan. It's amazing how many nuclear power plants are there. There is also the possibility of a nuclear detonation. I'm going to talk a good deal about this, but there's no notice. Everything will be released at once. The area around it could be highly contaminated, and fallout is bad stuff. You don't want to be in it. I'll talk about that a little bit more. But it's the highest hazard from a nuclear detonation is very early. Most of it released within the first hour. And there could be a dirty bomb event where somebody detonates material and it just spreads it around. There are a couple of interesting movies about this. One of them is called Dirty War, and the other one's called Dirty Bomb, about detonation in London. And these are very interesting movies that are quite dramatic. But the lower right hand corner there talks about long-term relocation areas, 20, 25, 30 more kilometers away from a detonation site. Next slide, please. This is an old Cold War diagram of the full nuclear strike on the United States and the targets and where the wind blows. 14-day radiation exposure doses, the effective wind 20 miles an hour from the west, but that doesn't include the upper level winds that blow this stuff. Next slide, please. An altitude detonation is what happened with Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's very different than somebody setting off a nuke on the ground. Because building construction with modern buildings, they're mostly heavy duty, they're masonry, they're steel, they will actually cause shadows. These slides are from Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. Next slide. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, awful. The buildings are mostly wood. Next slide. There's a lot of work going on how to deal with an improvised nuclear device or nuclear detonation, or in general, disaster involving radioactive material. These are some that are older, they've been updated, they're about the same, but there are more and more documents that are out there and available. Next slide. We take a zoned approach. We do it specifically. We define the zones. We identify which ones are priority, which ones responders should not go into. We prioritize the actions in the zone. We want to know where people can be safely in order to go and help. And believe me, as a physician, particularly an emergency medicine physician, you may be called to be the authority on dealing with this. So at some time in your career, you need to learn how to deal with radiological incidents. Next slide, please. If there's a detonation, there will be a severe damage zone. Buildings will collapse, could be a half a mile, and this is a fairly small nuke, a 10 kiloton. Notice this is Washington, D.C. See the White House on the lower left, and then Washington Monument. Next slide, please. Sorry, that's the Lincoln Memorial. Yeah. The moderate damage zone, save a lot of lives there, 1/2 to 1 mile out. There will be a bunch of damage and a bunch of sick people, but you will not be able to get to the severe zone. Next slide. A light damage zone, awful lot going on, broken glass, injuries, things like that. But there won't be a whole lot of severe injuries. One of the real dangers of a nuclear detonation is blindness. If you, go ahead, next slide. I have one coming up. There's also an effect called an electromagnetic pulse. This is one of the things that I know a lot about working in the defense industry. If any adversary were to launch or orbit a nuclear weapon 250 miles above Kansas, the entire North American continent, or most of it, would be blanketed by an incredibly powerful electromagnetic pulse. Okay, this is a movie I have. You can go over this. EMP will knock out any electrons. No power, no communication, no luck.
Let me pull up this real quickly.
We have a little video here for you to see. It's 6 minutes long. It's about the detonation of the nuclear device.
John, this is so relevant given the Ukraine situation. We'll talk about it more in a minute.
Yes, it is.
Can everyone hear that?
Yes.
Okay.
They throw it as far as they can.
The threat of a terrorist organization detonating an improvised nuclear device, IND, is very real. Our enemies are well funded and determined to strike us at home. With its relatively small size and weight, a 10-kiloton weapon is not difficult to conceal or transport. A 10-kiloton weapon is detonated in an urban center. Within millionths of a second, a luminous sphere of hot gases is formed. Temperatures may reach 10 million degrees centigrade, hotter than the sun. A strong updraft with inflowing winds called afterwinds is produced. The cloud may reach 5,000 feet in height and 1,000 feet in diameter. The initial response is key to saving lives, while awareness and strict adherence to procedures will protect responders from exposure to potentially lethal doses of radiation. For response purposes, the affected blast area is broken down into zones, beginning with ground zero and moving outward. No-go zone, moderate damage zone, light damage zone, and the fallout zone. The zone should be determined by the degree of observable physical damage. The EMP, Electromagnetic Pulse, may disable or permanently damage electronic equipment within 3 miles of ground zero, effectively knocking out responders' communications and public broadcasting. Operational equipment brought into the EMP zone after the detonation will not be affected. Responders entering the light damage zone, roughly 3 miles out from ground zero, will immediately notice the prevalence of broken windows. Injuries will initially be fairly light, requiring self or only outpatient care. As responders move inward toward ground zero, debris littering the streets, damaged vehicles, and downed power lines will make passage increasingly more difficult. Responders entering the moderate damage zone should expect significant damage to structures, including collapse and blown-out interiors. Sturdier buildings of reinforced concrete may remain standing. Substantial rubble, overturned vehicles, and fires will be encountered. Lighter commercial structures will be unstable, while most single-family houses will be destroyed. Visibility in the initial hours of response will be limited due to dust and smoke from fires. Additional hazards to responders in this zone include elevated radiation levels, downed power lines, and ruptured gas lines. The moderate damage zone will present the greatest opportunity for saving lives and should be the main focus area for rescue operations. Serious injuries from burns, flying debris, and crushing injuries should be expected. Any response tasks performed within the contaminated zones must have a dosimetry exposure plan in place to protect responders. Anyone with an unprotected line of sight of the burst up to 2 miles away may be subject to burn and severe eye injury, including blindness. While moving farther into the moderate damage zone, responders will need to be aware of the structural damage around them. When most buildings are collapsed or severely damaged, they have reached the no-go zone and should, under no circumstances, go any farther. At ground zero, the point vertically above or below the center of the blast, a crater with a radius of 20 meters is formed. From this point out to roughly 1 kilometer, just over half a mile, is a no-go zone for rescuers for 5 to 7 days. Few, if any, buildings will be standing. Rubble reaching a depth of 30 feet or more will make roads impassable. Anyone surviving the initial blast within the no-go zone will have received a lethal dose of the more intense initial radiation. They should be expected to die within the day. Within the first 60 minutes of a nuclear detonation, the most critical decision will be whether to evacuate or shelter in place those in the expected fallout zone. The primary recommendation is to initially shelter in place. Those in the open or in cars should seek larger structures and take refuge in the center of those buildings, placing as much distance between them and the fallout as possible. Communicating protective orders to the public will be crucial. The dangerous fallout zone may extend 10 to 20 miles from ground zero. The plume's direction is determined mainly by the upper atmosphere. This is not always apparent or may even be contradictory to ground level winds. The most hazardous particles are seen as sand-sized grains. Lack of this apparent fallout does not mean radiation is not present. Monitoring is the most effective method of defining the fallout zone. Fallout is subject to rapid radioactive decay. Consequently, the dangerous fallout zone will shrink with time. An educated and well-informed public before, during, and after an event is a critical component of any response effort. Neighbor helping neighbor is key to saving lives. The overwhelming majority of consequence management tasks, such as providing essential services, decontamination, treatment, security, food, and shelter, will take place outside of the contaminated zones. Effective consequence management will determine how much additional loss of life there will be after the initial event.
John, that was a hypothetical city, right? Just a hypothetical urban center somewhere?
Absolutely, entirely hypothetical. The only real thing in there was the video of the cloud going up and then moving from the upper level winds. Otherwise, it was entirely computer generated.
John, you've been going for an hour. You doing okay? You need to get up and go.
I'm doing great. I'm doing great.
All right, good. All right, let's keep rolling.
Mr. White, I think this would be a good time to stop and do a few questions, if you don't mind.
Okay, let me make a comment here, as that is from that video. Understand that one of the things that you need to know yourself right now, wherever you are, is where's the wind coming from and where it's going. People that live in Houston, Texas, near the vast petrochemical complex at Texas City, always know where the wind is coming from. They are downwind most of the time, but you need to know. So when you get ready to go out in the morning or evening or whenever, know where the wind is moving, so you have an understanding of where things could drift and go. Okay?
So, John, given the overwhelming fear in the minds of many people about anything, quote, nuclear, end quote, especially, what was that, the Daughters of the American Republic, or what was that? The do you ever
League of Women Voters.
Yeah. Do you ever think we will truly harness nuclear energy? And if so, what are your thoughts on the future of of nuclear waste management?
Well, I would say that number one, will we ever harness it? How good is your crystal ball? And, how much can we work together as a species? It may take an external threat of some sort. For instance, it could be a partial nuclear exchange between nuclear powers that significantly increases the background in the world. It could take a meteor. It could take aliens, which is not impossible, that force us to look at ourselves as a species instead of individual countries. I don't know about that. But as far as will we ever make good use of it, and will nuclear power ever be used effectively? We are using it now. The nuclear waste issue is so politically sensitive that science seems to be taking a back foot. There is a great deal of remaining energy left in spent nuclear fuel, just as there is a great deal of energy left in disassembled bombs that have plutonium. Plutonium is an amazingly excellent source of power, not just to blow things up, but to generate energy. And the key of using nuclear reactors for generating electricity, which basically what they do is they heat water. It's just a better way to heat water, is that you have a waste that needs to be stored in some place that is geologically stable in order to let it decay. And there are places in the world, in most continents, that are geologically stable. Yes, we're worried about things that could go for 100 million years. Are there geologic structures that have been stable for 100 million years? Yes, there are. This is not an insoluble problem, but it's politically very sensitive. So again, politics and science, they're not very compatible as near as I can tell.
And reactors have the opportunity for changing. A sodium reactor, for example?
Yes. And we don't have to build mammoth reactors like many of the ones we have now. And we don't have to build every one as a unique design. France, for instance, has standard design reactors. So when they have a problem with one of them, they fix all of them. The United States reactors are almost all unique. And so when you have a problem with one of them, it doesn't apply to the others. So, and there are new reactors coming out called modular reactors that can be very small, and still generate a lot of electricity that don't have the level of risk that comes with the mega reactors that put out many megawatts.
Okay, let's move back into medicine, for example. I'm going to start challenge you a little bit. You said single folks don't live as long, but if you receive more radiation from a partner, it would seem like if you get married, you don't live as long. What's the deal here?
One of my favorite questions, Ray. Thank you. I didn't prime him, by the way, folks. The chart that you saw regarding loss of life by certain factors is a risk chart. You notice that men and women were different. And it's not because men and women get different radiation exposures. It's because men work in industries that are inherently more risky, as well as what seems like one of your colleagues told me that our testosterone makes us crazy and their estrogen makes us crazier. So, yeah. But truthfully, you control a lot of factors in how long you live and how healthy you are by your behaviors, what you eat. We know this. It's axioms in medicine, certainly in various fields of medicine. You can control the level of risk and injury to your person by your behaviors.
So, John, should we be concerned about doctors who want to use diagnostic testing that involves radiation that could expose us? And as a second tack-on question, are women more vulnerable?
I think that the answer to your first question is we should go ahead and trust physicians that want to use radiation as a diagnostic tool, because the stresses on the body, on the human being from a radiation exposure, a diagnostic medical procedure, or for that matter, a therapeutic one, comparative risk is lower than, for instance, surgery. Surgery is hard on a body. And if you can go see what is going on there inside without cutting the patient open, putting them under anesthesia, particularly general anesthesia, and all the stresses that happen to the brain and the heart, I would think that a diagnostic radiation procedure is preferable to doing experimental or exploratory stuff because you can't figure it out. And there is a great amount of money being spent right now on trying to make the diagnostic procedures better. The one I gave earlier, prostate cancer. There's some diagnoses coming out about cervical cancer, as well as all the new vaccines using mRNA. We're making some real concrete progress, and one of the reasons I think we're making that progress is after 9/11, the federal government threw a challenge flag to all of the research institutions in this country and anywhere else for that matter to create fieldable tools as opposed to strictly theoretical or benchtop research. They said, give us some tools we can use. And so they spent a lot of money on that. And I think what we're seeing now is a result of that, where laboratories, including those at UT Southwestern, want translation. They are trying to come up with translation of research into usable tools.
All right, let's stay on the medicine track for a moment. So a person gets radioactive iodine, it's all pulled into their thyroid. Does the inverse square law apply to the other organs in the body, so that the further away, say the testicles, for example, or something that's further away, does that apply, that it's 1 foot, 2 foot, 3 feet away, that the inverse square law provides for protection to the other organs of the body when the thyroid is glowing?
Absolutely. And those exact dosages given when radioiodine is given are very much categorized and known. That is part of it. The target organ, of course, is the thyroid gland. The next target organ is the bladder. And the kidneys actually get less than the bladder because of dwell time. They're early on, when very large amounts of iodine were used for therapies, they would, by a standard, catheterize the patient to ensure that the bladder was continually emptied. And there was even an instance where there was a patient, I don't know why they did this, but there was a patient who was in final stage. I don't know what the disease was, but they decided to treat him for thyroid cancer. So they put had a catheter in, and they had the little plastic bag down by the bed, and that plastic bag got really hot. And so they had to use special procedures in order to empty the plastic urine bag the patient. But the short answer to your question is yes. The inverse square law affects it, as well as the fact that the tissue around the thyroid gives shielding. And water is an excellent shield for radiation, and your body is basically a bag of water.
So, in terms of the diagnostic use, John, of nuclear medicine, could you comment a little bit about that as far as how this science works, specifically how radioisotopes are being used to give us diagnostic information?
Certainly. We have run across, developed over many years, a radiopharmaceutical. The isotope is technetium-99M metastable. It comes from a molybdenum isotope. You used to be able to milk the generator in your nuclear medicine department and get isotopes and combine them with a pharmaceutical right there. And it turns out that that isotope, which has a half-life of only 6 hours, produces a 140 keV gamma in its metastable state. And that 140 keV gamma, your body is almost transparent to, like a window. It passes through you, does not do much damage on the way. And we have built equipment that is specifically designed to detect that level of radiation. And what we do is we tag a pharmaceutical that goes to a specific organ, let's say the liver. And we tag technetium-99, a few millicuries, like I showed on the chart earlier about how tens of millicuries are used in diagnosis. We tag that pharmaceutical, inject it directly into the patient, and it goes entirely to the liver. Better than 95% goes to the liver. It's excreted through the urinary system, but again, the tissues are not affected much by the 140 keV gamma. So what we do is we inject the patient with a radiopharmaceutical, Tech-99 pharmaceutical, and we put them under a $2 million camera that has all sorts of detectors in it. Some used to be old photomultiplier tubes, and now they're solid state detectors. And we can literally see not only the structure of the liver, but we can see the function. We can see voids in the liver where the tissues do not take it up. We can see abscesses in the liver. We got all sorts of things. So that's function as well as structure. We do this also with bones, with the brain, working these days on the prostate, kidneys, liver and spleen, of course, lungs. We're able to use. You bet. Sure. Able to use these on lungs to do a diagnostic procedure that gives the physician the information he needs to make the best medical decision for the patient.
Sure.
You bet.
I mean, there are people that we can't do a CAT scan on using iodinated contrast because, say, their kidneys are messed up. So we'll opt for a lung scan instead using the chemical that you described.
Right.
Last quick kind of funny question, and then I have an ask for you. This is non-medical sort of. Is standing in front of the microwave super dangerous?
No. As a matter of fact, microwaves are recommended for hiding your electronics in if you're worried about an electromagnetic pulse, because they are sealed very well. If it turns out that your microwave oven is defective, you can always have a little chocolate bar, a Hershey's chocolate bar around it, and if it starts melting, you know you have a problem. That's how microwaves were discovered. In 1947, an airman in the United States Army Air Corps, I think it was Air Force by then, was standing in front of one of the hot new radars on a plane, and he had a chocolate bar in the pocket of his shirt, and he felt kind of warm, and the chocolate bar melted and ran down his shirt. Bingo, microwaves warm things up. The first available microwave oven for the home was an Amana radar range in 1972, cost $3,000 in 1972 dollars. But they learned, actually, the microwave oven is the second most efficient cooking tool mankind has developed. The most efficient cooking tool is the wok. So the microwave oven is right behind that in terms of getting energy into food to cook it.
All right, John. And then just as a last ask of you, many of the folks online tonight, you've had 230 online with you tonight, John. Could we get some recommendations from you for suggested reading list that we can update from time to time? Because this stuff is fascinating, and any recommendations on reading resources would be really appreciated. We may reach out to you and post this online beside your talk. We give a lot of reading sources for the students who tune in.
Oh, good. Well, I do have a reference sheet that is really designed around my field The first third of it deals with improvised nuclear devices, and it's not just what happens with them. There's also, from the Mailman College in New York, there's a very interesting paper on the diaspora of people away from a major event, whether it's a Hurricane Katrina or a nuclear detonation. So that's the first third. The second third is general radiation references, and the last third is about electromagnetic pulse and solar storm. So I have a reference sheet, and one of the things that I would recommend that your attendees do is start paying attention to general radiation topics, because it's kind of arcane. There are not a lot of people that really understand and dive in to what radiation does, but we are using it more and more. We even have the possibility of a nuclear detonation with the war going on. You mentioned Ukraine, and it would not surprise me in the least if Vladimir Putin used a tactical nuke on Kiev. That would be a horrible thing. I think that paying general attention to the use of radiation in medicine and as a tool for humankind to be a very good idea.
How many kilotons, or would it be larger than that, would a tactical nuke be? Hiroshima was about 10 kilotons or 13.
That's a tactical nuke, anywhere from 10 to 20, and they go up way up from there. Megatons, 200 megatons.
It's interesting that I read about this all the time, and one part of my original reading about this, they called the original nukes city killers. Because instead of having to fly overhead with multiple bombers and set up a fire like happened in Dresden, where the city was burned down by hundreds of aircraft flying over it, you could take one aircraft, or now a rocket, and send a single device that would kill the city.
Yes, the end of World War II is the prime example. The decision was made to use a nuclear weapon because they were looking at 1 million casualties from invading Japan. And one of the problems with the bombs that were used is that the buildings in Japan at the time are made out of wood and paper. So they caught fire. I've got a slide coming up that talks about the energy from a nuclear weapon. And 10 kiloton would be a city killer, not just from the radiation, but most of the energy from one of those things comes out as a blast.
I'm sharing with you right now something that's on my desktop that I've been reading slowly, which was about the decision to use the atom bomb. This is written in 47, but of course it was in August 6th of 1945. And then 2 days later, August 8th for Nagasaki.
Yes.
Very interesting stuff. All right, John, take it away. You doing okay? You need a sip of water, or are you doing all right?
Doing great. I've got water right here. Let's rock and roll.
Rock and roll.
This is what happens when a nuclear device detonates. Most of the energy comes out in blast. Now, I know y'all can't see it. I couldn't change the font color. To the left side, there is two words, blast 50%. The upper right is thermal, and the lower right, the yellow, is fallout. The initial radiation is only about 10% of, or less, actually about 5% of the energy put out by a nuclear weapon. The reason, guys, that I'm telling you more about these nuclear weapons is you need to be able to understand the type of environment that would occur, whether or not you are near it, or you go assist with it, or it happens in your country. It doesn't matter, or in a country near you. A detonation of a nuclear weapon these days will change the world. Next slide, please. So, 10 kiloton yield, 5 miles away. This is light. It is so bright that if you throw your arm over your eyes and squint hard, your eyes will still be able to resolve the bones in your arm. That bright. You need to train yourself that whenever you see a bright light to look down. Put your skull in between wherever that is and your eyes. Next slide. This is the light coming from that. It's so terribly illuminating. Next slide. The house catches on fire from the thermal pulse. We saw shadows of people on concrete walls in Hiroshima where they were sitting there, and the thermal pulse burned their shadow onto the wall. Next slide. And the house is utterly destroyed 5 miles away. Doesn't take a very large nuclear weapon. Hospitals are often in the zone near the center of a city, and then they're in the fallout zone outside of the detonation zone. This is a 250 kiloton detonation modeled in Atlanta. Next slide, please. New York, same issue. The wind is predominantly from the west and it blows fallout out on Long Island. Look where the hospitals are. Those hospitals would not be accessible for close to 2 days. This stuff decays away real fast, but it's nasty hot. It's primarily sand-sized grains. So what they do to decontaminate equipment is brush it off. Next slide. What is fallout? Over 200 isotopes, 36 elements, 2 ounces of fission products from each kiloton of yield, but 2 ounces is a lot of material. Next slide. Early fallout hits the ground in the first 24 hours. The early fallout fraction is 50 to 70% of the total radioactivity. That means it's really hot, really fast. There's a rule of 7, 7 minutes, 7 hours, 7 days, 7 weeks, where it drops off exponentially. Next slide. Delayed fallout is the very fine invisible particles. You're going to be wearing a mask, you bet. 40% of the total radioactivity, but it takes a long time, much lower degree of risk compared to the early fallout. So after about 36 hours, 48 hours, you can actually go outside, but you still need to wear a mask. What I tell people is, hey, at your school, whether it's a medical school or whatever, at your home, do you have the ability to stay completely inside, huddled in the smallest, lowest room in your home for 2 days? That's what you may need to do. Next. In the past, we did radiation training, basic radiation physics, manage the risk, understand the language. Next slide. One of the problems that we have is where is it going? We are understanding more. We have computer codes that will model exactly where the fallout cloud goes. Federal assets from our country or any country will arrive late. All emergencies are local and immediate. So all people, including you who work in the hospital, are going to be dealing with this yourself a long time before federal assets show up. Could be 24, could be 48 hours. And that's with a very rapid response system called the Radiological Assistance Program. If for Dallas, Texas, it's out of Albuquerque, New Mexico. All the RAP programs have jets standing on the tarmac 24/7 to get wherever they need to go. Next slide.
John, why the lowest room in the house to huddle in from the fallout?
Very good. Excellent question. It's because of distance. You want to be as far away from the fallout as possible in the center of the structure because it's going to come down on the roof and it's going to come down outside. Wind may blow it up against one of the surfaces of your house. You want to be as far away from the outside surface of any structure as you can get. The further underground, the better. But if you just have a regular single-story residence like I do, my bathroom is directly in the center of the house, directly into the peak of the roof, and that's where we'll go. That's also where the bathtub is, where we go during a tornado. Okay? What you're seeing here is people that are going to need to be evacuated. Yep, what's the problem? Well, number one, they're scared. That could be things are destroyed. Understand that people not only get radiation exposure, they also get fear strong enough to give them symptoms that mimic radiation exposure. Next slide, please. Your first instinct might be to run. Next slide. But if you run, you might be here, out there under the fallout. You don't want to be there. Okay, we've seen this one before. There's a difference between the atmospheric burst and the surface burst. There'd be shadows. For instance, if there was a detonation in downtown Dallas, 5 miles away is UT Southwestern. But the buildings in downtown Dallas are masonry and steel. So they are liable to cause a number of shadows. Where those shadows be, who knows? Next. This is the zoned approach. I'm repeating this so you understand that we have tools that allow us to manage how we respond to a major event like this. Next slide. So you use specific interventional techniques. Number one, you treat the medical emergency first. You cannot get enough exposure from a patient that's been contaminated to cause you injury. Let me give you an example. Suppose this patient is contaminated and has a reading on them. They've taken their clothes off. They've maybe washed them down. They're down to 10 millirem an hour, which is a reasonable thing. How long can you work on that patient? If your limit is 5,000 millirem, how many hours? 500 hours. That's a long time. You may have 500 or 1,000 patients. Do you work on every one of them for an hour? Not likely. The point is, this is a manageable risk. We know what to do. First thing you do is treat the emergent condition. Next thing you do is decontaminate the person. If you got somebody that's enclosed with the stuff all over them, you just treat whatever emergent, stop the bleeder, stop the squirter, and then get them on to decon. Then we have decorporation pharmaceuticals that are specific to prevent absorption. Stable iodine we give to patients that may have been exposed to radioactive iodine. And this could happen in a vehicle accident too, because iodine is moved around on trucks in most of the cities in the world every day. And if there's an accident, we might have to give stable iodine to block the thyroid gland. It must be given within 4 hours in order to block the thyroid gland. Prussian blue removes heavy metals from the gastrointestinal system, but it tends to be constipating. So you need to give it with bran or something to move it on through. Lots of water, because if there's tritium in particular, you're flushing out the entire system. There are things such as calcium blockers that we know how to give. As a matter of fact, one of the people I talked to recommended Bluebell ice cream because it has a whole lot of sodium alginate in it from seaweed and tends to block calcium uptake. Any non-emergent treatment needs to be delayed for people that have been around a nuclear detonation. Go ahead. Next slide. So this is how radiation persons are viewed, okay? Pretty weird, folks. This is me in 1977. I'm sitting on top of a nuclear medicine gamma camera head. In 1977, that thing cost $250,000, but my 160 pounds meant nothing to that 5,000-pound gamma head. That is a chart of the nuclides behind me. So many isotopes out there that are used for so many things. You know, actually, EMS docs are really kind of viewed as strange people too. Next slide.
John, you said, oh God, where did you get that?
I wouldn't know.
Well, I bought that car because of you. The students tonight don't know that you're a Mercedes nut, and you advised me to buy that car. So I bought it used, 5 years old, and I've still got it 17 years later. Can you believe it?
Wonderful car. And you told me once that the stereo in the car is better than the stereo in your home.
And I drive around town getting 40 miles to the gallon. You know, you got to love it.
Yep, love it, love it. Well, next slide. The radiation person and a lot of the information that you have thrown at you looks like this. So I understand if a lot of what I've talked to you about tonight has been kind of confusing, but understand that this is not rocket science, okay? The radiation is actually fairly simple. It's like any other stressor on the system, and it's like any other hazard that you manage. You just need to understand that you can manage the risk. Okay, next slide. That's all I have for you. That is my email address. If you wish to send me an email, I'll be glad to respond. I understand that Dr. Fowler will have the latest bug out bag checklist and reference sheet. I talked about the reference sheet. The one more thing that you might want to send out is the bug out bag checklist. There is a city called Anniston, Alabama. Used to be a United States Army Chemical Weapons Depot there, and the people there that lived in that town next to the United States Army Chemical Weapons Depot had to be able to leave their home right now. That doesn't mean get things together, you got 10 minutes. That means, come on, out the door. So they gave them a bug out bag checklist where you buy something at a Cordura bag at Walmart, and here's your checklist, and you throw things in it. And then when it's time to go, you can still live your life without the internet and have the critical information and survival tools you need. So that's all I have, Dr. Fowler. I'll be glad to entertain any questions.
Yeah, we got some questions for you. John, going back, well, firstly, you said something a while ago that piqued my interest. You said there were 37 different elements that were in
nuclear detonation.
That's 1/3 of the periodic table.
Yes, that's correct. It's very broad because neutrons make things radioactive. So atoms that could be stable, for instance, iron in the structure of the bomb's shell or aluminum could be activated by the neutrons and changed to a completely different element. So yes, by all the tests that we have done, and we've done quite a few, we know what is produced in a nuclear detonation.
So John, overall, what kind of radiation is our biggest concern? And what activities should we possibly avoid? Is it cosmic rays, or is it medical radiation? What's our biggest, or is it what's happening right now with the threats from Russia regarding their invasion of the Ukraine and saying that they are putting their nukes on standby? I mean, and boy, this is a timely talk given what's happening in the Ukraine.
Well, let's deal with that in parts, okay? Which radiation is of most concern? Well, neutrons really are, because they make things radioactive, but we don't encounter them very much. There can be shipments on the road of radioactive waste, and if there's any kind of accident, that'll be on CNN as the end of the world as we know it. Betas tend to be pretty strong. You want to watch out for betas. Some of them have, for instance, phosphorus 32 that's used in urology and work on kidneys, particularly in laboratories there at UC Southwestern, is a pretty strong beta, 14 feet range in air. But the number one thing is getting the material inside of you. That is why I am just delighted, even though it's been so painful for us all, about the COVID pandemic, is that people are more used to wearing masks. Because now you have a tool. I have carried a mask in my glove compartment for decades, because if anything happens out there, I'm going to put on my mask, because the number one route of bad stuff into your body is your respiratory system. Your lungs are about the size of half a tennis court. You have that much surface area. So anything you breathe in gets loaded in there, and who knows where it goes. It can be translocated to a particular organ system. It does damage. So I think that wearing a mask helps. And to the second part of your question, what should be worried about in general life? Yeah, a transportation accident would be serious. A nuclear detonation would be terrible. But with what has happened recently in Ukraine, as soon as I heard that Vladimir Putin was rattling the nuclear saber, I started getting my gear together in case Dallas is hit. You know, I want to go away. The other thing that I'm aware of is the electromagnetic pulse that I talked about earlier. And that could really do major damage. It's estimated that 90% of the population in any area that's hit by an EMP will die. And the reason is, if food cannot be transported, if it shuts down trucks and tractors and refrigeration, if food cannot be transported, then the population will shrink to what the land around it will support. Think about that. That's very serious. There's a couple of references I have on my reference sheet of a book or two. One is called 1 Second After, about an electromagnetic pulse attack. So as soon as I heard Putin started rattling the saber, I started getting my stuff together. Yes, sir.
And you know, another one, you touched on it, but let's come back to it for a moment, which is radon in your home.
Yes. Very good question. We don't have radon in North Texas. Where we get radon is in Texas, is in certain areas, under the Caprock, Amarillo, and Lubbock, and out around Elephant Rock, northwest of Austin, and our state capitol building, which is all pink granite, and in your kitchen, because your kitchen countertop can be granite. What's in granite that's radioactive? The answer, uranium. So the Rocky Mountains are uranium. So yeah, there's radon exposure, and EPA considers radon exposure to be one of the top radiation hazards to people. And as a result, when you have a nice little cabin in the woods in the west of Georgia, you need to ventilate that thing, because it'll come out of the ground, because Georgia's in granite too.
There's no question that's true. We actually blasted down onto the granite to build the house and then poured concrete on it. And in the wine cellar, I actually measured the radon level, and it was out the roof. And they contacted me, the people that measured it, and so they told me to keep the door open and let the air, blow it out of there. And then we remeasured with the door open, and it was fine.
Yeah. Well, the problem is keeping it closed off as you do a wine cellar tends to allow the radon to concentrate. So you might consider a solar-powered or passive ventilation system. But the point is that wherever you live, you need to know if you have that kind of hazard. They sell radon test kits you put under your sink, where the pipes come out of the slab or the crawl space, and see if you've got radon coming into your house.
On a parallel note, John, there was an article from UT Southwestern's Cancer Research Center today talking about the 4 genes that make the ribosome in the cells, which of course provide the fulcrum by which DNA is copied. And it was talking about CRISPR gene editing to help repair ribosomes. I thought that was very interesting.
Very interesting. And there are products you can take, for instance, ficitin tends to stimulate senescent apoptosis. Cells that are in your body that are getting old and live past their prime, it encourages those cells to die for your body to replace them. So there's all sorts of gene therapies coming along that are direct, like CRISPR, and indirect.
Back to a specific nuclear reactor question. Didn't the people who died in the Fukushima disaster really die from the tidal wave, from the tsunami, and not from?
Absolutely, that's exactly correct. Most of the deaths, almost all of the deaths at Fukushima were because of the tidal wave and panic and roads collapsing, falling down. Very few died from radiation. I think that the number is on the palm of one hand, 1 or 5. It's a very small amount, and there's a great deal of fear. Again, this is a situation where the people are so scared they got sick, and that mimics nausea can mimic radiation exposure.
3 quick questions. Do Bluetooth AirPods you put in your ears release radiation?
They use electromagnetic radiation. It's very low energy, very long wavelength. And the Bluetooth, we're in this field all the time from our power system at 60 hertz and from our phones at 900 megahertz, very high frequency for a radio, but still way below infrared. So there are some discussions about near infrared stimulating cell regeneration, but I think that really the radios and the digital devices are so low frequency, not anywhere near the ionizing range, that there's no appreciable damage to the body at all. Like I said, Homo sap is pretty resilient.
3 quick things, actually 2 things, and then 1 point I want to share with you. What are the effects of a lifetime without sunglasses?
Oh, cataracts. Hey, the sun is a bad boy. You get out there, you're going to get lots of radiation in your eyes. Yeah, you're going to get damage from visible light. Same thing with skin, melanoma. I see my dermatologist every 6 months. I'm an Irishman who grew up in Texas.
All right. Should we be concerned about how radiation may affect our pets?
Of course you should. It's like any living being. On the other hand, most pets don't live very long. Dogs, 15, 20 years, maybe at the most. Some birds live longer. They have a very high metabolism. I'm certainly not an expert on that, but yeah, you can be concerned about that, but I doubt that they are more sensitive to radiation than you are.
Yeah. And finally, really, John, is there any way to reverse the damage that our cells may acquire?
Oh my goodness, from radiation exposure? Well, there's all sorts of research. There is a species of bacteria called radiodurans that they found around Chernobyl. They found around other places. There have been some reactors have had to be dumped into the sea from submarines. And there is a great deal, I believe there is a vent, a lava vent, not off Hawaii, but someplace in the South Pacific, where there's quite a bit of radioactive material that's coming out of the vent, and there are bacteria down there that seem to thrive on the radiation. There's a lot of research going on how to reverse and ameliorate radiation damage. That jury is way out, and we will probably see some advances there within the next 10 years.
Well, following on to that, then, why are cockroaches apparently so good at resisting radiation?
I don't know, but scorpions are too. After they had the Trinity atomic tests, they went out there and were shining the ultraviolet light. Scorpions actually glow under ultraviolet, but they were shining the light, and scorpions thought it was just a nice, warm, sunny day. Insects are very, very simple. They're not anywhere nearly as complex as we are. And there are some species that have radiation, have repair mechanisms to the DNA that are far superior to ours. And I know, yes, again, there is a significant amount of research going on about this exact topic, particularly in Oak Ridge.
Well, John, thank you. And as we wrap up now, I want to share a comment that just came over. When will we bring you back again to talk to us? And by the way, you need to start a YouTube channel of your own.
I can tell you, there's no business like show business. I'll be back.
Thank you, John. God bless you. Aditya, you want to take it away and kind of wrap this thing up?
Yes, sir. So in the chat right now, oh, actually, that did not send properly. Let me resend that. I'll be sending a link in the chat. I'll also be sharing my screen with a QR code in 1 second.
Also in the chat is the link to the exam and the online for the video. And you also, we're going to do session 20 again, right?
Yes, sir.
And offer examination credit for that one with a certificate, right?
Yes, sir. So upon completion of this week's quiz, you will receive a certificate, and that will verify your attendance and participation in this week's quiz. And that will be due next week by 6:59 p.m. We are also putting into chat the link to session 20, a rerun, reopening one of the past sessions. That will have no due date, but it is only available to students that are attending this live session and are here right now. So props to you for sticking around till the end. Dr. Fowler, any closing remarks?
Oh, yeah. Listen, John, if you're still there, I'd like to ask everybody online, all 220 of you, to put in, "Thank you, Mr. White." And John, I want you to see hundreds of very grateful comments coming across from these terrific students from all over the world today. And we are just so very, very thankful, John, that you are able to join us and be part of this session. John,
I'm very impressed.
John, we're going to place this session on our YouTube channel, and we'll have probably 5,000 pre-healthcare individuals that will watch it. And each one of those individuals will probably see 100,000 patients in their careers. 5,000 times 100,000 is 500 million. So John White, tonight you've touched 500 million lives. So God bless you, you sweet man. We are so grateful for your kindness. So everybody, we're going to wrap up. Great session. Wow, what a terrific, sobering session, especially at this time in this history of humanity and world events that are going on right now. So very, very important. We want to thank you for coming. We'll be here next week. We have many more great lectures lined up. One of the ones we're going to line up is the former chair of the admissions committee at UT Southwestern, Dennis Burns, who's also a neuropathologist. And I know you'll want to be there for that session. We have a dermatologist coming up and just lots of other terrific people. So on behalf of the wonderful John White, thank you, John. I really appreciate it. I owe you lunch or a drink in the club. On behalf of the whole virtual shadowing working group who labor in week after week to put these together, we want to thank you for coming, and we want to